Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for Mapping Indigenous and African American Stories. My name is Ellen Hoobler. I am the William B. Ziff Jr. Associate Curator of the Art of the Americas at the Walters Art Museum, and so excited to welcome everybody at home watching tonight. We acknowledge the original stewards of the land on which the City of Baltimore and subsequently the museum was created. Specifically, we would like to acknowledge that the Walters Art Museum exists on the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock and Piscataway nations, as well as the home territory of the Lumbee and Cherokee peoples. Today, I am in conversation with Ashley Minner and Vince Leggett to discuss the importance of mapping cultural sites and the strategy of using maps to confront the erasure and colonial whitewashing of Indigenous and Native and African American cultures in this country. I would like to say that support for the Walters Art Museum is made possible through the combined generosity of individual donors, foundations, corporations, and grants from the City of Baltimore, Maryland State Arts Council, citizens of Baltimore County, and Howard County Government and Howard County Arts Council. Please note that this program is being recorded and will be available on the museum's YouTube channel and Facebook page. I have a few quick notes before we get started. Tonight's program is live, and we invite you to type your questions into the chat. Please know that the program is being recorded and will be available after this meeting on the museum's YouTube channel and Facebook page. So now on to our program. Tonight, I'm very excited that we are joined by Ashley Minner and Vince Leggett. Ashley Minner is a community-based visual artist and folklorist from Baltimore, Maryland, and an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. She earned her MA and MFA in community arts from the Maryland Institute College of Art and her PhD just this past year in American Studies from the University of Maryland College Park. In addition to maintaining her practice as an artist, Ashley works as an assistant curator of history and culture at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. Much of Ashley's art and scholarship has focused on the Lumbee community of East Baltimore. Vince Leggett is the founder and president of the Blacks of the Chesapeake Foundation. The Blacks of the Chesapeake Foundation documents the significant contributions of African Americans in the maritime and seafood-related industries. The Library of Congress and the U.S. Congress have designated the Blacks of the Chesapeake as a local legacy project. While Leggett describes himself as, quote, a country boy from East Baltimore, he has also received many honors, among them being an Admiral of the Bay, as well as many others. He is also president and CEO of the Leggett Group USA, an Annapolis-based consulting firm which specializes in government relations, public affairs, and advocacy. Vince earned a BS degree in urban planning and community development from Morgan State University and a master's degree in public administration from Central Michigan University. So I'm really excited to talk to both Ashley and Vince, but I just wanted to note that there are such direct parallels to this theme of mapping to one case, one part of the exhibition that the Walters Art Museum has up through this Sunday, November 7th. The exhibition is Translations and Transitions, or Traducciones y Transiciones, a celebration of Mexican and Central American independence, 1821 to 2021. And although your projects are very 21st century, I see these connections with one theme within the exhibition in which we see a contrast between two maps. On the left, as you see here on the screen, a European map, which is beautiful but non-specific about Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs' capital, the capital of the Aztecs, or the Mexica, as they would have called themselves. I contrast that with a map in indigenous style, which we see on the right, which through the glyphs that ring the central figure and scenes there at the bottom, encode not just geography, but also the history and the events of the place within the frame of the physical environment. So somebody I talked to very recently just talked about this idea of almost a four-dimensionality of this map, that it's bringing in not just space, but also time and events. So it's a very exciting kind of concept. But the other thing that this theme illustrates is the idea of who has the right to make the map. The idea that maps will depend very much on who is making them. And we know living in Baltimore that streets are so often named for either wealthy white settlers, maybe Revolutionary War generals, or other people like that. And so that means that their lives are already directly encoded into the landscape by the inclusion of their names on street signs and landmarks. But I see both of your projects as re-inscribing histories that are often either forgotten, overlooked, or outright suppressed, and reinscribing those histories back onto the landscapes that you engage with, whether that is the fabric of urban Baltimore in the case of Ashley's project, or the Chesapeake Bay and surrounding areas for Vince's project. So let's start with you, Ashley. How did you realize that you needed to document Lumbee and Native Baltimore? What do you hope to preserve for future generations, and how are you going about that project?
Thank you, Ellen. Well, I'll begin to answer your question by going a little bit further back in time to acknowledge also, as you did, that Baltimore is part of the ancestral homelands of the Piscataway and the Susquehannock peoples. This is a screenshot from nativeland.ca where you can look up any place in the world, I think, at this point and see whose land you occupy. And the process by which those people were dispossessed of this land is historically specific. It happened through paper. This is a detail of the 1652 treaty whereby the Susquehannocks ceded the land that would become Baltimore to the colony of Maryland. The largest population of American Indian people in the Baltimore region are actually not indigenous to Maryland. They're the members of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, like I am. And we are descended from folks who come from a pretty wide swath of territory, from as far north as the James River in Virginia and as far south as the Great Peedy River in South Carolina. And fleeing disease and colonial warfare, we coalesced in a place that is today known as Robeson County, North Carolina, prior to the establishment of the United States. And this is what it looks like there. This is the Lumbee River from which we take our name, and it winds its way through our tribal territory. You can see it's pretty dark and murky and swampy, otherwise known as Drowning Creek. What doesn't look like the river in the swamp looks a lot like farm fields. To this day, it's a very rural agricultural place. And around the turn of the century, many Lumbee families were dispossessed of their homeland through the Southern agricultural system, and they found themselves sharecropping. And this is actually a family photo of my grandma, my two uncles, and my mom when they were a farming family in Robeson County. And so lore holds, and it's true that Lumbee soldiers returning from World War II passed through major cities like Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Detroit, realized it would be easier to work in a factory and support their families than cropping tobacco that was somebody else's land, somebody else's crop in a place that was segregated. Because you have to remember, North Carolina was part of the Jim Crow South, and in this part of the world, there was triracial segregation, black, white, and Indian. And so Lumbee people settled in Baltimore, in East Baltimore, in an area that bridges the neighborhoods of Upper Fells Point and Washington Hill by the thousands. And here's some Lumbee ladies in the 1940s. You can see they started to have access to nice things. And this is the area. And actually, the arrow on this map points to where my great-grandfather was living when he passed away in 1948 on a street that no longer exists. And so anywhere from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s, there were, we don't have great numbers, 2,000 to 7,000 Lumbee Indians living in this little part of the city. They established the Baltimore American Indian Center, and this is where I spent a lot of time growing up, and they established many, many more sites that are no longer visible on the landscape today for a complex set of reasons, from urban renewal to gentrification to upward mobility. And I have been curious to learn what used to be in the neighborhood that Indian people established, because today it's a place where people look at someone who looks like me and ask, "What are you?" Or they look at some of the young people I've worked with as though they don't belong there, as though they don't have a history there, and we do. So here I am with some of my elders, the first time we gathered to talk about the neighborhood that they had called their reservation when it really was one. I found this 1969 map called the Lumbee Community in Baltimore, and I got really excited because it had more sites than I knew about from my own lifetime. And it also has racial and ethnic vernacular of the time, and it also has a big swath labeled Urban Renewal Area Vacant, which was a good clue. But anyway, I brought them this map, and I was like, "Look, I found your reservation." And they were like, "No, this is all wrong. It's not even close. Nothing's in the right place. So much is missing." And I said, "Well, could you mark the map up? Could you plot what's missing or correct what's here?" And they said, "No, it would be easier to just turn it over and make our own maps." And so, in conversation with one another, they went alley by alley, street by street, block by block, and re they created maps reflecting the reservation from their youth, and you can just see the difference in the amount of information from that 1969 map to this one drawn by Miss Jeanette Hunt in 2018. However, if every one of these squares represents a city block, it's kind of hard to tell where this stuff was, which is what I told them. And they said, "What you should have done is you should have made us a big street map that we could have filled in together." And that's what we did the next time. And here's my Aunt Jeanette pointing to where she lived when she first came to Baltimore. But even still, having visited this neighborhood my entire life, I wasn't correlating what they were telling me I should be able to point out on the landscape with what I know from walking there. And I said, "I'm not going to get it until we all go there together and you show me physically what I'm supposed to be seeing." And they said, "Okay." So, Aunt Jeanette got in the car with me and we were riding down East Baltimore Street, and she told me to pull over in a place where I wasn't expecting to pull over, and got out and pointed up into this park and said, "This is where I lived when I first came to Baltimore, in the 1700 block of East Baltimore Street." And I said, "Aunt Jeanette, you lived in the park?" And she said, "No, these all used to be apartment houses." And that's when I realized that basically every space American Indian people owned or occupied during this time is now either vacant or green space, or so completely transformed it's unrecognizable. So I've been in the archives looking for documents to corroborate all the great stories my elders are telling me. I found us everywhere, in the vertical files at the Enoch Pratt, in Sanborn maps, which are fire insurance maps that give really detailed information about um, buildings and neighborhoods and streets and how they change over time. I found slides of the Indian Center in the Baltimore City archives. And I really started to flesh out this walking tour that I had been working on, which originally only contained 3 stops, because that's all that I knew from my own lifetime. And you can just get an idea from this early Google version of how many more we uncovered. I'm very pleased to say that thanks to a number of funders, and most especially the Robert W. Deutsch Foundation, through a fellowship I had this past summer, we've produced a print guide to East Baltimore's historic American Indian reservation. And I've collaborated with a number of artists and designers to bring this to fruition. Here are just some early PDF drafts. We got our first proof last week. This will be a free resource available where people get such things. And then also we're having a website dedicated to the same subject, which has, sites that we couldn't include in a print version due to limitations of print, with more information and all the sources so people can look at it and see the same materials I was looking at to arrive at the conclusions that I did. You can tour the reservation online through this site, because not everybody's going to come to Baltimore. Also working with a geographer to do ArcGIS mapping using the Sanborn maps to just plot how our communities spread and moved over time and how the neighborhoods changed. It's an example of the database my geographer is working with. And also an exciting thing, we're going to have a cell phone app of the walking tour that will be available on both Apple and Android platforms for free. And this was a collaboration with Dr. Elizabeth Rule, who is a Chickasaw citizen, and she did the Indigenous Guide to DC. So here's just a couple of images to show you what that interface will look like. And so mapping has been transformative for our community. It's reconnected us to a landscape that by and large we don't inhabit anymore, other than going to church and to events at the Indian Center. So I had to do it so that our young people and people even my age and maybe a little bit older would realize that our history is much deeper and wider than what can be easily perceived by through what's left, and to know that we belong here as much as anyone does, and we have a future here too. Thank you.
Wow, that is a really exciting project. I have a lot of questions, but I think it would be great also to hear from Vince and to hear a little bit about some similarities and differences between your projects. So Vince, I have to say, as I was reading articles about you and your work and how you got interested in this, that you were inspired in part because as a schoolboy, you had a really ignorant teacher who told you and your class that Harriet Tubman never would have crossed the Chesapeake in a boat when she was leading enslaved peoples to safety and to freedom, because in her words, Blacks don't sail boats and Blacks weren't explorers. So obviously somebody who needed a lot of knowledge and teaching, but it's amazing how deep-seated prejudices can blind people to very obvious conclusions. But this was something that was part of what piqued your interest. Tell us about how you began to work on the history of African Americans on the Chesapeake and what forms that project has taken for you.
Well, first, I'd just like to thank the Walters family for extending this opportunity. And it's a real treat to stand side by side, hand in hand, and heart with Ms. Minor. That is a real joy. And every time I hear her share, it just touches heartstrings, because as your introduction indicated, I described myself as a country boy from East Baltimore. And once the audience stopped laughing, saying there's nothing country in East Baltimore, I go on and explain what I mean by that. That both of my parents migrated from North Carolina to Baltimore in the early 1950s. My mom was from the Rocky Mount area of North Carolina, a little crossroad town called Tillery that was part of the New Deal with Roosevelt. My dad was from below Fayetteville in Laurinburg and Maxton, Robinson County, and Scotland County. And again, my mom's folks owned their own farm. Her dad, her granddad owned their own farms. They were preachers and educators in the community of Tillery and Rich Square, North Carolina. But my dad's family was more of a sharecropping family, a remnant from enslavement. And they lived in large communal areas up on the North 40 or down in the Hollow, as it was, because it was land that wasn't suitable for growing cotton or tobacco. And they did a lot of truck farming, cantaloupes and watermelons and peanuts and cotton and things of this nature. But what I really saw was a marked difference. And every summer we lived in East Baltimore. And every summer, my mom and dad would pack us up in the station wagons and ship us to the country. And so I worked in cotton and peanuts and tobacco and soybeans and ran the rivers and the creeks and the streams. And even today, when I look back at my beloved Baltimore and other communities that I go into, it's still a lot of people have never walked on a dirt path. There are many people who have never stomped in a mud puddle. And I'm still fascinated by mud puddles. I mean, it's just something about the brown or the black murky waters, and you just never know what's in there. And then if the sun hits the mud puddle in a certain way, it kind of glistens and shines and talk to you. And so I'll always love stomping in mud puddles. But when I described myself as a country boy from East Baltimore, I gave that self description on a golf course one day, and the guy said, "Sir, I understand every word you said. I was just saying it half flippantly." He said he translated country boy from East Baltimore, meaning I was street smart and had a strong work ethic. And that suit fitted me very well because, again, I grew up in East Baltimore, Hartford and 25th, near Clifton Park, John Hopkins Hospital, and recently I've begun to work with the East Baltimore Historical Library, which is part of the Greater Hopkins Complex, Nina Redmond and Keisha Webster's and others. And we recently did a documentary film or oral histories that's going to lead to a documentary called I Am Baltimore. And one of the things I insisted from the documentarians is that I told them that I knew the alleys of better Baltimore better than I did the streets. And I said, whatever you cut out of your documentary, my oral history, leave that in. Because if some of my old homeboys and homegirls see that, they're going to say, I know that's right. And that'll be the end of that story. Because again, as we try to share our experiences, sometimes it comes with warts and blemishes. But what I try to do with my work is lift up a downtrodden people. Through Blacks of the Chesapeake, we have been documenting the contributions that African Americans have made to the maritime and seafood processing industry. And we began this work over 30 years ago. And thank you for that reference to Columbus School number 99, because in Baltimore, we knew our schools by numbers. And I think there's some magic to that and not names. But my school was Columbus 99 at North and Washington Street, East Baltimore. And they would normally study Christopher Columbus. I mean, that was what we would study. And then back then in the late 50s, they had Negro History Week, Colored History Day, and then they would lift up the Benjamin Banneker's that had a Maryland connection, the Frederick Douglasses, the Harriet Tubman. And so we had a teacher decided that she was going to put on a play with Harriet Tubman. And I knew more about Harriet Tubman than anybody in that class, the teacher, the principal, or anybody. And I raised my hand, little East Baltimore Vinny, and said I wanted to be Harriet Tubman. I've been a progressive for a long time. And so she said, no, sit down, little Vinny. You're not going to be Harriet Tubman. So I huffed and puffed, and then she kind of cast the play. And in this case, we were in an integrated school because in the late 50s, early 50s, part of Baltimore was integrated. And so she told me and the other students that we were going to be the slaves. She picked a white student to be Harriet Tubman and told us to crawl across the room to Canada. I was on fire. My hair stood up, my ears started wiggling, and my nose spread. But I knew not to show up or out because my mother was a special education teacher down the hallway. And so I had to play nice in the sandbox. But one of the things I would say is that really kind of set me on a quest to try to tell a broader story. Yes, she said that Negro, colored, African American, Black didn't sail, weren't explorers. But through my work through Blacks of the Chesapeake, I have discovered that, yes, the Chesapeake Bay and its many tributaries were used as an integral part of the Underground Railroad. I made that speech one day that was picked up by the APY service, New York Times, and Washington Post. And the Maryland Historical Society summons me to Baltimore. Said, Mr. Leggett, I hear you making big speeches down here in Annapolis. And they invited me up, and we just kind of talked about some of my findings. And I'm sure Dr. Minor will appreciate that. They said, Vince, if you do more questioning than exclaiming, perhaps we might find ways to collaborate. They said, well, Vince, if you change to your whole hypothesis to what extent did the Chesapeake Bay and its many tributaries aid and abet the Underground Railroad to slavery? I mean, I'm still East Baltimore Vinny, so I kind of walked out on North Avenue and walked up and down the street and just said, these guys are trying to play me. I know what I'm talking about. I cited their citations. So they couldn't question the citations that I was providing for them. But then they got into, to what extent? Yeah, your guys might have got lucky. One got through, two got through. That doesn't make a case. And so I finally yielded and changed my speech somewhat to raise the question, to what extent? And so I've been collaborating with scholars and researchers and community historians, continue to build this case in a project we call Chesapeake Underground, Charting a Course to Freedom. And one of the undisputed claims for many of the biographers of Harriet Tubman and everyone else is that she instructed members of her family to hire a fishing boat in Cambridge and sailed to Botkin Point. And this is the headwaters coming into the Patapsco River of Baltimore City. And from there, she met them at Botkin Point and went on to Baltimore, Fells Point, and other areas that had a rich maritime and seafood history. Even Frederick Douglass worked as a ship caulker in the Fells Point area. You had Isaac Myers, the Chesapeake Marine and Dry Dock, and that's on the site of the Living Classroom platform down in Fells Point and Thames Street. And so the story has been continued to build. But one of the things I find is trying to tell the story through ebony eyes. And so one of my publications is called The Chesapeake Bay Through Ebony Eyes because I loved to read even as a kid. I lived up on 1729 Cliffview Avenue. This is off of Harford and 25th Street. And we had a white lady that lived next door to us on our street. And she gave me all of her National Geographic magazines. She had them tied with string in bundles 3 or 4 feet high. And she had them all over the front porch and the back porch. And she fed me raisin bread. It's something about a combination of National Geographic and raisin bread. Little Vinny thought he was somebody. I mean, when we had school projects, I'd mix in a photo or a picture from Afro magazine, Jet magazine, Ebony magazine, but I spiced it up with those glossy, pretty pictures from National Geographic. And people said, where did this guy get these from? And I would win book contests and poster contests. And just that whole combination of National Geographic, Ebony, and Jet helped inform my book, The Chesapeake Bay Through Ebony Eyes, because so often when I do oral histories and interviews, one old waterman, Earl White from the Lower Eastern Shore, said, Vince, if you're going to tell the story, tell it straight or don't tell it at all. People just like to romanticize about how beautiful the sunrises are and how beautiful the sunsets are. But he said, Vince, the Chesapeake Bay, the Patapsco River, the ancient Potomac, as well as the Patuxent are rivers of hope and rivers of despair. That many of our ancestors and foreparents are buried in unmarked graves at the bottom of these waterways. And if these waterways could talk, what story would they tell? And so I visited the deep end of the pool and the shallow end, gathering stories and histories. And so again, working with the East Baltimore Historical Library, I'll be working with them because my background is urban planning and community development. And so often when we talk about mapping, because the National Historic Preservation Organization in Washington, I'm an advisor to a national project mapping African-American sites on the Chesapeake Bay. And so often when I go into my community and talk about mapping, they are spatial maps, they are virtual maps, but they are also cultural maps. And again, even the word mapping gets kind of tricky because I can even remember in one of my schools, I saw maps from 1590 something of the Chesapeake Bay, and they turned it in a horizontal orientation versus a vertical orientation from the Capes of Virginia and Cape Charles at the lower part of the bay where it meets the Atlantic Ocean up to what is now the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, Havre de Grace, Susquehanna may be towns our viewing and listening audience may be familiar with. But once they spun that map to run more horizontal, my whole perspective changed in terms of what was up and what was down and what was east and what was south. And so a lot of times it's through juxtaposition and spin the map every now and then. And I like what Dr. Miner said. No, they said, let's start from scratch. We're going to spin this map around, and then we're going to go in the field and ground truth it. Because so often that's how you unlock truth, that it's been set in a certain way, and we've been conditioned to look at the Chesapeake Bay from the top to the bottom. But when I began to look at it east and west and north and south and spun it around like a Rubik's Cube, I just discovered a whole different viewpoint. So I think that this whole work about erasure, about people telling stories in their own voice, and particularly in the African American community, because so often when I deal with scholars and researchers, they press me for primary records. And I say to them that my folks legally couldn't read or write, and you're pressing me for primary records. And so I said, I'll take the oral histories from the griots and the elders in our community. You have more dollars and more time and more expertise, and maybe collectively we can pull together court records and probate records and estate records and all kind of primary things to help collaborate many of the stories that have been passed down generationally. So right now, I'll just put a pin in it for a moment, because as I told the managers of this program, I enjoy the Q&A. I can talk for hours about this subject because I'm so passionate about it, but I always try to be stakeholder driven. And so, Madam Chairperson, I'll put a pin in it, but I reserve the right to speak again. Thank you.
You will definitely be accorded the right to speak again. I do have a comment here for you that says, John Ford says, they would have been amazed, that your teacher would have been amazed to know that Harriet Tubman commanded an amphibious assault for the Union Army. So that certainly would, I'm not familiar with that episode, but that clearly would contradict everything that your teacher was saying. So it does sound like she really needed to go back to school herself. Anyway, we do have a couple of questions here so far, or a question and a comment for Ashley. Let's start with those, and we'll wait and see what other questions pop into the chat here. But Amy asks, Ashley, do you know when the walking tour app will be available for download? And thank you for the outstanding presentation.
Thank you, Amy. We're launching everything at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on November 22nd. That's a Monday. You can subscribe to my newsletter on ashleyminnerart.com. If you want to be on distribution for the link, that's probably the easiest way at this point, because I got a running list of everybody who wants the information, but everyone's invited. It will also be on StreamYard, hosted by the Baltimore American Indian Center and Baltimore Center Stage, and come celebrate with us, and you can download the app on that day.
That's great. That's great. And it looks like we've got some crowdsourcing of information as well. Robin Naviaski Redding says that her grandfather owned a building at about 1000 East Baltimore Street, which was divided into apartments and rented to Lumbee tenants. But she sold the building in 1952 when her grandfather died.
Very cool. Thank you for commenting. I looked it up quickly. It looks like it'd be about Baltimore and Exeter Street, which seems close to downtown, but I don't doubt it. And I'd love to talk to you if you're interested. This research doesn't end. Like, I'll never know everything there is to know about the neighborhood and who lived there.
Yeah, it's such a fantastic and really interesting project, and it kind of echoes other projects. I love this sort of digital reconstruction of something that's not that no longer exists physically, but that we can still access through modern technology. And I love that there's also a walking tour that you're promoting with the pamphlet that you're making as well. Because I think there is something, I was really struck by what you were talking about. There's something so visceral about walking the places and, seeing a picture and then comparing that to the park that's there in front of you and being like, whoa, there were these buildings here. I guess one question is, who do you hope will use the app? And, um, you know, what has been the response so far, either from Lumbee peoples or from other peoples? Oh, and we've got more questions probably for both of you, but let me just ask that question: who do you hope will use the app, and what has been the response so far? But then we've got a very big question for Motorhouse Baltimore.
Well, I hope the general public will use the app. You know, anybody who's interested, and there's been a great response since I've been working on this since about 2016 when I led the first little walking tour. So many people have contributed to the project, so it's almost like we have a built-in audience. Every Lumbee in Baltimore is excited about this, and a bunch at home in North Carolina, and plenty of other American Indian folks in the city and elsewhere. And you know, I am wary. I used to take. I was recently a professor at UMBC in the Department of American Studies, and every semester without fail, I would take my class, you know, prior to the pandemic down to the neighborhood. And I'm like, look, this is what we're doing. This is, you know, look around, because to be sure, there are traces in the neighborhood. You can look and see some of these places where they used to be, or, you know, the few that are still open and active. And it's the neighborhood continues to transform quickly, and it is actively gentrifying. And I am mindful of the fact that I've brought a bunch of people who don't live there or wouldn't normally have business there down there to walk through, and we do get looks and reactions sometimes, mostly positive. You know, people are curious, they want to talk and share about their history too. But you know, that is something that's been on my mind. Like, I hope droves of people don't go show up on Broadway. And you know, one major thing that hasn't been included on any of the maps are the individual homes of Indian people, which are really what made the reservation what it was. But you know, there's a few that still live in the neighborhood, and I can't have whoever from wherever showing up to see Miss Annabelle Hunt, for example. Like, that would not be cool. So yeah, but I hope everybody uses the app.
Oh, that's great. No, I mean, I was just thinking in terms of like, there's all this value for people who are not physically in Baltimore, but then there's also value for people who will be with the app, but then also like just physically walking. I mean, it's kind of a both and situation, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, and to that point, like, the elders who worked on this with me for so long, they're my primary audience. So I wanted to have something in print for them, because they're paper people, and so am I, for that matter. But the app is, and the website are for people who can't get here physically, or you know, you can see it from wherever you are.
Oh, that's so great. So we have one very specific question for Vince, and then I have this fabulous question for Motorhouse that I keep talking about, but we will get to. But Linda Davis asks, or Linda Viss asks, thank you, Mr. Leggett. Did Harriet Tubman stop at Bodkin Point? Do you know where exactly that was? And in the meantime, John Preston Ford, we maybe don't need to put this up, but he actually gave us the name of the specific raid that Harriet Tubman had coordinated. But yeah, Bodkin Point.
Well, a couple of points. I don't know the actual location, but again, historians have looked into the whole Gibson Island area, Bodkin Point coming into Bodkin Creek. And so from that particular story, we've had artists kind of reconstruct the types of boats, the types of clothes that the enslaved people would have been on. And even there's a mural down in Cambridge at the Harriet Tubman Education and Museum on Ray Street, where she has an extended hand. And it's just something about hands. And I loved Harriet Tubman so much because she looked like my grandmama. And even that indication about the Civil War, that's how Mrs. Tubman got the name General. She was called Moses up on the Chesapeake when she was down on the PD River. And that's just another connection I have with Dr. Minor when she said some of her folks migrated from South Carolina near the PD River. That again, that particular raid, there was 700 enslaved people that were courted to freedom under the general's leadership. And just so often, again, Warder and Frederick Douglass even talked about how this bay should yet keep him free. One point I want to make real quick is that so often when I talk about the Chesapeake Bay, people just kind of narrow it down to a greenie issue. Well, it's more than a greenie issue. It's more than saving the fish for the fish sake or saving the trees for the trees sake. It's an economic issue. And my point is the Chesapeake Bay and thereof is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And there are efforts trying to save the bay one meeting at a time. But so often when I go to these meetings and Bayside events, it's very seldom you see people of color. And so one thing I try to do if I'm teaching or talking to a third grader or postdoctorate or a United States senator, I have the same message. They say, well, Vince, where is the on-ramp? We can't find it. And that's the postdoc and the third grader. Neither one of them can find the on-ramp. And so that's part of our work as well, advocacy, trying to show people it's an economic issue. And African Americans have a rich history on the Chesapeake Bay, a storied history. But it's one thing to not include us in your books, documentaries. It's another thing to airbrush us out of the picture. And that's what I'm really trying to do is rediscover and illuminate down in the cracks, because I do believe American history is African American history and African American history is American history, and it can't be told separate and apart. It just needs to have a deeper dive.
Oh, that is great. I mean, I think that leads us directly into this question that Motorhouse has asked, which is there any way that we, the public, can help support the work you are both doing? I don't know, maybe take that one at a time, but think about, if there's, I guess, downloading the app and engaging with your websites, but I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth.
Download the app, visit the website, donate to the Baltimore American Indian Center, certainly. It's possible to donate to this project directly. Now we have a fiscal sponsorship relationship with Fractured Atlas. If you feel so moved, I think the Baltimore Indian Center could use your dollars more. And yeah, just remind people that we're here, like know that we're here, because most people don't know that. November's National American Indian Heritage Month. And, remember that, know that, let people know. And then remember that we're still around after November and all the months in between now and next November.
And I'll take a shot at it. Our overall theme for Blacks of the Chesapeake is called A Campaign to Preserve a Local Legacy. And local legacies are all throughout the Chesapeake Bay region. And we work on the Eastern Shore, Lower Shore, Upper Bay, but also collaborate throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. And we are currently in the middle of a project with the Maryland Center for History and Culture, as well as work with the Maryland State Archives to inventory, digitize, and catalog the extensive 30-year collection of the Blacks of the Chesapeake, and with resources, and we call it the 3 T's, your time, your talent, and your treasure. We'll take all 3 of them, the 3 T's, because many times your expertise and talent can go further than $1, go further than $1,000 because of the expertise. And again, you can go to our website, but what we're really trying to do is to make our extensive collection available for scholars, teachers, students, and the general community, because I'm a former school board president in Anne Arundel County, Annapolis, Maryland. And rather than complain about what the systems don't have, we've begun to write our own books and curriculum guides and field trips and those types of things to give the young people an opportunity to learn more about their history and heritage and their connection to the Bay, because so many of them just look at the Chesapeake Bay as a playground for the rich.
Yeah, that is a really good point that this is something that belongs to a much broader swath of the population than we realized. And I guess part of bringing in a broader part of the population goes to this idea of oral history. So I think Sharon Gallagher has a great question here for both of you, Ashley and Vince. Other than your publications, how and where are you capturing the oral histories? There's such important questions, important oral histories. The people are such important resources when we ask the questions.
Well, oral history's the backbone of everything I do. That started way before the mapping project started, and I agree with you. So I'm very thankful that the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, Alvin O'Kuhn Library and Special Collections, they've agreed to start a new collection, the Ashley Minter collection, where all of the things I found in archives everywhere, we're working through permissions together to get them all into one place that's publicly accessible. This includes all the oral histories I've recorded. We're also planning an archives day at the Baltimore American Indian Center when it's safe, where people can come in and have their material culture documented, like, photos, whatever, but also learn how to do a recording, record their stories, be recorded themselves if they like, for themselves or for the collection or for both. And other people can also contribute to this collection. That's why it's the Ashley Minter collection, not the Ashley Minter papers. So really excited about that. It's part of the Maryland Folklife Archives, which are the records of the Maryland Traditions program. It's our state folklife program. And we've had support also from the American Folklore Society in making this possible. So just like really exciting time. And our first person processing the collection is a Lumbee library science grad student who grew up on the reservation, Tiffany Chavis. So, and we're working on a also. Can you tell I'm excited? We're doing a shared stewardship agreement, so our community members maintain some control and responsibility over the items in the collection, and that's kind of like cutting edge, and we're figuring out as we go. But that's where we're preserving our oral histories.
Wow, that's fantastic. That's really fantastic to hear. So that's the Alvin O'Kuhn Library at UMBC?
Yep, special collections, they rock.
Archivists in general rock. And what about you, Vince? How I know just looking at your website that you are collecting like individual histories. Have you worked with oral histories? And yeah.
Yeah, we've done 30 years of oral histories, and one of the things when we began to work with the Maryland Archives, they did a vulnerability assessment of our 30-year collection. And one thing that we're proud of is that the Blacks of the Chesapeake has kept the lights on 30 consecutive years. And what I say about that is for community-based, non-institution-based, non-money-based, to continue to show up, because I do believe in order to make systemic changes, you have to show up 30 straight years as a minimum, because we've all seen comets. They burn bright, they fly across the landscape, but as they say, shots fired, no report. And to just continue to show up. And one of the things that we are doing is the oral histories, cassette tapes, VHS. I mean, things that have a 25-year shelf life if you're lucky, because we didn't have best conservation practices, temperature control. I might have had on a boxing gloves rather than a mask and archival gloves. And so they are just kind of showing community people how to be better stewards of these fragile resources, because many of the individuals that I began to do oral histories about 30 years ago were already 70 years of age. And so as we look at the vanishing landscape, but also the vanishing peoplescape, and so I think that that is saying that with resources, again, the 3 T's, time, talent, and treasure, we'll accept all 3 because it can help expedite the proper care of this extensive collection. Recently, I coordinated a field experience for Al Roker's show, Today's Show All Day, because we have a program called From the Bay to the Table. And we had Eastern Shore crabbers and watermen on the boats. Al Roker went to Fairley's market and ate crab cakes and those kinds of things. And so as the visibility of our work increases, because we are part of a global community, but the demand increases. And so again, just trying to get resources. And I know that for many of my peers, whether they're heading major environmental groups, I try to act like I'm a trust fund baby as well, because it's hard to keep going to meetings 12 o'clock in the day, 2 o'clock in the day. And so often we look around and say, does the African American care about the environment, the Chesapeake Bay, history and culture? Yes, we do care. But so often people try to interpret our lack of not being at their meetings as don't care. So I wake up every morning trying to smash that myth that we do care about our own history, culture, and want to leave a better world than we found it.
Wow, that is so great. We have one kind of very specific question here and then a broader question. So John Haka asks, for Vince, well, two things. He asks, could you link the app? So I think we do have a website that will go live on the 22nd, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe we can put that into the chat. Is it Be More Reservation? Is that right? Or anyway, we will put that into the chat. We have that on our document. And otherwise, how would they search for the app in the App Store? And then we have a question there for Vince as well about how the Black community was connected by the maritime industry up and down the East Coast specifically. And then I think we'll shift from that on to Veronica's question about kind of controlling one's own heritage. But let's start with this. Sorry. Yes. Two questions for both. One question for each of you.
Dr. Minor, go ahead.
So yeah, Ashley, how would they search for the app it may not be available in the App Store yet. It will be available as of the 22nd. Is that correct?
Yes. Guide to Indigenous Baltimore. And you can find it in Google Play and the App Store. Great.
And then Vince, this is an interesting question. I think what they're asking is, was the Black community connected, or were there broader connections across an African American community beyond the Chesapeake, but starting with the Chesapeake, and then, you're talking about specific rivers in North Carolina. Is there this broader connections further up and down the East Coast?
Yes, I would say that one, I'll ask you all to put the Blacks of the Chesapeake's website in the chat as well, where people can kind of go and better understand our work and get a broader historical context. But yes, I mean, even in the early beginnings of the Americas, it started on the Chesapeake Bay, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware. So everything traveled by water. And so whether you were enslaved or free, everything moved on the water. So African Americans have been boat builders and sail makers and owners of seafood processing plants. African Americans have participated in every military campaign on the Chesapeake Bay from 1776, Star Spangled Banner, Francis Scott Key. Free and enslaved people were at Bladensburg in Washington, D.C., Fort McHenry, the War of 1812, the Civil War. So African Americans have been involved from a maritime standpoint in all military campaigns, but not only fishing, picking crabs and shucking oysters, but owning boat clubs and yachting clubs. And we collaborate with individuals from the Georgia Sea Islands, St. John, St. Helena, St. Augustine, New Orleans, the Caribbean Basin, all throughout the Canary Islands. So it's really a worldwide movement. You can travel the 7 seas right from Baltimore's Inner Harbor and never have to touch land. And one thing that we have found out in the African American community is that no one knew it was going one creek over. And this is the magic that I've found by doing this work for 30 years, that when you're doing subsistence fishing, subsistence living, you don't have time to check over one creek over, two creeks over and see what they're doing. You're barely hanging on yourself. But we've been able to get 30,000 feet up in the air and see a broader picture. And we've begun to connect those dots. And so when people talk about Bethlehem Steel, Sparrows Point, they don't understand that was shipbuilding. When they see Domino sugar in the harbor, these spices traveled from around the world. African Americans were longshoremen and stevedores and boat captains and stewards. And when they smell McCormick spices, I mean, the banana boats that came into Baltimore, all of that is maritime based, but somehow people, it's never been framed up that way as an economic issue and a maritime issue. And that's what we do through our work, to cast it in a different lens and look at it through ebony eyes.
Oh, that's wonderful. That is really wonderful. I think that's a really complete answer to that question. We do have a really specific question here from Veronica Betancourt, who is the Director of Interpretation at the Baltimore Museum of Art. This is specifically for Ashley, and so maybe I'm going to put the two of you together because Veronica would like to know more about the shared stewardship agreement and what the process of structuring that agreement looked like. So I'm going to make sure to put the two of you together by email because we really just have about 2 more minutes. I think one last quick question, maybe just for 30 seconds, each of you would be from, the last question would then be from Fiona Whitefield. What are some methods you've used to connect new people to your work? I will say that we've got in the chat now websites for both of your projects. We've got both Blacks of the Chesapeake Foundation, and we also have Ashley's website, baltimorereservation.com, which you can follow right now on Instagram at Baltimore Reservation. And the website will be live as well as the app on the 22nd of this month. But maybe let's go to this question just briefly. Methods you've used to connect new people to your work, or things you're excited about, ways you're excited about connecting new people to your work in the future.
Well, I do a lot of speaking, like a lot, especially this month. It's Heritage Month, so it's the busiest time of year. And I also send out a newsletter just 4 times a year. If you sign up, I promise not to spam you. But that's gotten a pretty wide reach. And prior to the pandemic, I did a lot of traveling, and I'd share my work when I'd go as an artist. And I also just have that thing where, like, I meet someone on the street and they tell me their whole life story, or, like in the aisle at the grocery store, or that's just what happens. I think maybe it's like folklorist disease, or I enjoy it. It's not really a malady, but, I build connections with new folks however I can. And if anyone wants to connect with me, you can follow me on Instagram, check out my website, send me an email. I'm not hard to find. And I look forward to hearing from you.
And what I would say is, again, through strategic alliances and collaborations, I mean, we do a lot of work with media, national media, international media. We've done work with PBS and Maryland Public TV. So again, we're using technology. And the last 18 months, when we were all locked down on COVID, we've got even more aggressive with technology, having simulcasts and podcasts and those types of things all around the world, connecting people. When we've done documentary films, story quilts, and just trying to find many ways to tell a story, because we all have different learning modalities, some by field, text, sight. And so we just try to be like the Vegematic, try to find 1,000 different ways to tell an old story. But also, one old elder said, Vince, if you want something remembered, tell it to the children. And so inclusion for me, pound for pound and dollar for dollar, I'd rather invest in a 4-year-old with the time and dollars I have left on this great earth and a 4-year-old, because if I teach it good there, it'll live a little bit longer. And thank you.
Oh, that is so great. That is so great. Well, this hour has just flown by. I want to say a huge thanks to our guests today, Ashley Minner and Vince Leggett, for being here with us today. On a personal note, we've done a bunch of programming surrounding the Translations and Transitions exhibition, and this is the final program, but it's been such a rich one. Like, I think this has really just been such a rich program for me. I also want to say a big thank you to our digital team for producing this program, but especially to Sydney Adamson and to Paloma Feliciano for their amazing work, but also to Joy Davis and Allison Gulick for all the work that they did. We have also, I would like to give a huge thank you as well to the audience for sharing this experience with us. And we welcome you to come back for more programs on our social platforms. We've got tons of links in the chat there if you want to know more about our fabulous speakers today and their projects. And please come and visit the Walters in person or see some of our previous talks at thewalters.org.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Vince.
Thank you both. Thank you.
Thank you.